League of Nations. The League of Nations. What a cracking idea. Originally, I believe it was Edward Grey, the Foreign Secretary of Britain during the war's idea. But Woodrow Wilson latched onto it, and it was his main point of the 14 points. And he gave up a lot, compromised a lot, to make sure the League of Nations was included as part of the Treaty of Versailles. All of which is ironic, because the Americans never joined. Now, what was the League of Nations for? Security, obviously. To make sure another war would never start again. A war like World War I. There had been a lack of any sort of organisation like the League of Nations before the war, so having one there would be a precaution which would stop another war, in theory. It had lots of other jobs to do as well. Commissions on labour and slavery and refugees and drugs, women's rights, human rights, but the main reason it was set up in after World War I was the idea of collective security, that if all the nations worked together against an aggressive state, then that would stop a war from breaking out, or the idea that these countries would do that would deter the countries in the first place. So, how was it set up? Well, it had an assembly where all the countries, and there were lots of countries. It started off with 32 and increased to 50 odd countries at its highest, but countries came and went at various points. For example, Germany joined in 26 and left in 33. All of those countries could come and meet once a year at the assembly, and they all had a vote, but that was too slow and unwieldy for immediate decisions, so it also had a council. And on the council there were 4 permanent members to start off with, although this number changed as well over time. The 4 immediate ones were Britain, France, Italy and Japan, and then some temporary members who rotated from time to time. And these all had a vote on issues of international diplomacy and security, but it had to be unanimous, so each country had a veto. So the organisation was flawed in its covenant, its constitution, from the start. It wasn't a strong structure. The covenant itself was vague and long-winded. You might remember when we read through it. Article 16 is probably the most famous out of it, and that stated if any member of the League resorted to war, then the others would intervene and impose economic or possibly military sanctions. So that's the collective security. However, obviously, the League of Nations had not got its own army and was reliant on the great powers to supply them with troops, which the great powers were unwilling to do. Mainly because they didn't want their troops under the leadership of anyone other than their own generals. Economic sanctions were also a problem because they would hurt the countries imposing them, sometimes as much as the countries that they were imposed upon. However, despite these weaknesses and the fact that America wasn't involved, Russia wasn't involved, Germany wasn't involved, some of the potentially most powerful countries in the world, was very popular in Britain. Not in America, because they believed they wanted to stay out of European affairs, but in Britain it was seen by the public anyway as a good thing, and especially by the left, the Labour Party. The Conservatives and the army and many politicians believe that Britain really shouldn't trust it and rely upon their own tried and tested means of diplomacy, by maintaining the balance of power and gunboat diplomacy with a large gun or stick. And because it relied on these powers like Britain and France, and they never fully undertook their role, and they often undermined it, it was never the force that it could have been. Part of the problem was that Britain and France had different views on what it should be. Lloyd George and many British people, in the government anyway, believed that Versailles was too harsh by the time that it was signed, and saw the League of Nations as a way to revise it in Germany's favour. The French, on the other hand, took the opposing point of view. They believed that Versailles was not harsh enough, and thought the League was there to consolidate the peace, the Carthaginian peace that they got, and make sure that none of those terms were broken. So, for those reasons, it was never the organisation that it should have been. It did have some minor successes in the 20s. One example is the Ireland Islands, which were disputed between Finland and Sweden, and the League stepped in, awarded the islands to Finland, and Sweden accepted. However, when strong powers such as Italy were involved in the Corfu crisis, the League was less effective, and Mussolini himself, I shall paraphrase this because I can't remember the exact quote, said, "The League is works when sparrows shout, but falls when eagles quarrel," because it could not stand up to strong countries. And the main reason was because Britain and France were the driving force behind the League, and often those strong countries were its allies, and Britain and France were more willing to side or not annoy their allies than put their faith fully in the League of Nations. What I will say is that it was successful in those non-military roles, the commissions on human rights and refugees and World Health, etc.